Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I know it's a little bit later than your typical conference panel, but kudos to ORF and Samir for making these panels, I think, quite interesting and a draw and providing you some liquid courage to attend and bear with us this evening. My name's Eli Sugarman. I lead an initiative at the Hewlett Foundation, a large philanthropy based in the States that focuses on cybersecurity and internet policy. We're lucky enough to support some of the great Indian institutions in the room, and I'm very pleased to moderate this discussion today that's really going to focus on threats to democracy, online threats, influence operations, information operations, and the like. And I'm going to start by just giving you a quick introduction of our panel, ask a few questions to really tease out this complicated topical area, and then really have a free-flowing conversation with everybody on stage. And then we'll make sure that we save some time for your questions from the audience. So to my right is Dan Schueftan, Director of National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa, who's coming to us from Israel. Next to him is Latha Reddy, co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, and formerly a senior government official here in India. Next to her is Dr. Gulshan, the National Cybersecurity Coordinator here in India. Next, we have Katie Horvath, Director of Global Politics and Government Outreach at Facebook. And last but not least, we have Alex Klimburg, who's Director of the Global Commission on Cyberspace Stability, and also has a few other think tank affiliations I think he'll tell us about as the conversation progresses. So to launch right in, I thought I'd start with Alex and really ask him to explain what's the relationship or the difference between cyber operations and influence operations. We hear those terms a lot. I think oftentimes they get conflated. So why don't we start the conversation with what is it that we're actually talking about?
Thank you, Eli, and thanks to the organizers, in particular Samir, for inviting me back. And congratulations to Samir, what I presume, on what is a fiendishly clever plan on having this session so close to exhaustion, alcohol, and kava. I hope the outcome will be to his satisfaction. Also allow me to say that today I'm speaking on behalf of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. We have our co-chair, Latha Reddy, here from the Global Commission, and I think she'll make some remarks in that capacity. So to come back to the question that Eli posed, I actually think it's a major problem that we sometimes conflate information warfare and cyber operations. So from a Western liberal democratic point of view, sometimes it's a means to an end. So you could use cyber operations for an information warfare effect. And the most obvious example of that can, of course, be the 2016 US presidential elections, where it was quite obvious why certain entities were hacked and what information was then subsequently used for. You also can use cyber means for particular cyber outcomes like intellectual property theft or so-called preparing the battle space. But you also have a situation where you can use, for instance, cyber operations, but actually what you're doing is information warfare. So information warfare is actually the real goal, but you're pretending that you're doing cyber operations. And I think this is actually the biggest threat, because this is where we can actually have so-called inadvertent escalation or misunderstandings in cyberspace that can actually lead to conflict and war. So one of the reasons why this occurs is that there's a fundamental different view of how we view cyber in a conflict paradigm. In the Western powers, the idea is mostly that cyber is a technical issue, the worst possible outcome is cyber war, and that means destroyed critical infrastructure. In countries like Russia and China, it's mostly not a technical issue, it's a psychological issue. The worst possible outcome is information warfare, and that means regime change. So we have two very different views on what cyber actually means, what the information domain means, and that means that we sometimes misunderstand what a cyber activity is at a certain time. So for instance, as a defender, in the West, for instance, I might perceive there to be a cyber attack that is directed against my critical infrastructure or my company's intellectual property, and I might be wondering, what do they want to do with the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of the data? But in point of fact, what the attacker is really doing is they're trying to influence the wider political narrative, the wider debate. Now, there are many examples of where this may have occurred, but there's one particular example I want to leave you with, and that was the April 2015 attack on the French TV network TF5. So this was a TV network with 6 channels that was knocked offline by a cyber attack, probably one of the worst ever at the time, that was ostensibly by the cyber caliphate. And suddenly we had cyber terrorism for the first time ever. A real cyber terrorist group had actually gotten active and done real damage to a major infrastructure. And for a couple of months, that was a narrative, until it transpired through French government leaks that they thought the real attackers were a group called APT-28, commonly associated with the Russian government. So the question was, why did they engage, if that was correct attribution, in this attack that was effectively a false flag cyber terrorist attack, pretending to be cyber terrorist? And the answer that came out was that they were actually, in part at least, perhaps trying to influence the European legislative process, which at that time was drafting the very first piece of EU cyber legislation, the Network and Information Security Directive. And I can tell you that they nearly were successful in introducing a whole new narrative at a very crucial period of this debate. So finally, I just want to leave people with the notion that the threat of these false flag cyber attacks is not declining. In my opinion, it's increasing, and that will remain an issue in the future. Similarly, it's important never to lose sight of what the information warfare objective might be behind the cyber operations. It's not necessarily the data that people are after, it's your opinions. So every single time you are confronted with a serious cyber incident, don't think about the data that's being stolen. Think about how it changes your opinion about the entire ecosystem or the politics at large. So I'll leave it at there.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I think that's a great segue into a question I'd like to ask Katie. And I think building on the beautiful display that Facebook has set up in the registration area, can you explain a little bit what the role of a social media platform and company is in addressing these threats, and how Facebook thinks about partnering with industry, government, civil society to really address some of the challenges that Alex just, I think, very succinctly outlined for us?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to add my thanks to everyone for joining. So at Facebook, there's a lot of work that we've obviously been needing to do since 2016 in terms of looking at how we can protect the integrity of our platform, and I particularly focus on it in the elections space. Though this work is happening across the board. I think for us, one of the things that we have particularly been learning a lot about and thinking a lot about is over the last year with elections, in Mexico, Brazil, the United States, is really what is the role that we need to be playing as a social network, and what do we need to be doing for our part in protecting and stopping what might be happening on our platform. But we're one piece of that puzzle. We alone cannot do this. And so we have been trying to develop a lot of really close partnerships with governments to help flag things to us that they may see. For instance, a couple days before the US midterms, we got a flag from the FBI that led to us to taking down some accounts that we saw on both Facebook and Instagram that were trying to potentially influence not just the midterm elections, but there were some that were targeted, particularly in Instagram, to France as well, but also to working with civil society and third-party organizations. So we partner closely with the Atlantic Council and their Digital Forensics Research Lab, where they can be flagging to us many of these issues and things that they might be seeing in elections that then allow us to then investigate what might be happening on our platform. But then we can also work with other companies as well to see what might be happening, because some of these things, they might be organizing on 4chan or 8chan or Reddit or Twitter or on other places too before it moves into Facebook. And that's a very tactical side. I think zooming out as well, the other thing as well is that we are still in the middle, I feel, of very much defining what this means in this new world. What are some bad actors are very clearly defined, others are not. How does this look at when you look at foreign actors versus domestic actors in these countries? And I think the other thing too is that defining what is or is not okay in this space is something that we need to do collectively as a society in determining that, so that we can better then be able to fight these on our platform, while also making sure that we're not doing too much to restrict free speech or censoring people.
Great, thank you, Katie. And I think I'd like to go to Ambassador Reddy next, then Dr. Wright, come back to you. And Latha, my question is, as Alex and Katie have highlighted, these are, of course, global challenges. And it's really challenging to combat them globally. And so, given your experience and roles in different global efforts, could you walk us through how do we think about addressing these threats globally? Are there any promising approaches that have started to take root? And what role, if any, do international norms play in really helping us out?
Thank you, Eli. Eli, I think the issue is not how do we begin to, address issues globally. It's already happening globally. The question is that, as Joe Nye would say, what we've got is a hugely complex system of interwoven agencies that are looking at different aspects of cyber operations. It's what he calls the regime complex, and I think that's a very good word for it. And there have been enormous initiatives taken in different international bodies. Very briefly, and this is going to sound like an alphabet soup, so I apologize in advance. You've had the UNGGEs, the governmental group of experts. You've had the UN Secretary General's high-level panel, which has recently been set up. You've had other UN agencies like UNIDIR. You've had the WSIS. You've had the Tunis Agenda. You've had now a new open-ended working group being set up in the UN. You've got a new UNGGE. You have the Internet Governance Forum, and there's the G20, BRICS, OECD, ASEAN, think tanks, and finally commissions like my own. I've actually been on 2 commissions, one which was headed by Carl Bildt on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, and now I'm the co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which essentially Alex runs very efficiently, and runs us all very efficiently, if I may say so. And so you've had the Paris peace process in France recently that was just launched. And there's a plethora of multi-sector, I would say, sectoral approaches through the private sector, because you've had Microsoft's Digital Peace Initiative or campaign, you've had the Tech Accord, and so on. And which models and approaches? I would say one that consolidates all existing initiatives and somehow goes further, creates a structure to accommodate all such moves towards creating international norms. Could it be a digital Red Cross? Could it be something like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization? Could it be something like IAEA? But I think most importantly, it has to be multi-stakeholder. It can't just be governments. You have to involve the private sector, you have to involve technical organizations. And finally, how would norms help to counter threats of influence operations, for example? Let me give you an example. Our own Global Commission developed a norm which says state and non-state actors should not pursue, support, or allow cyber operations intended to disrupt the technical infrastructure essential to elections, referenda, or plebiscites. We took a conscious decision, as our remit was the stability of cyberspace, not the content of cyberspace, to restrict our norm to the question of technology infrastructure related to elections, the disruption of that infrastructure. And we did not address the question of content, fake news, or propaganda. But if you look at the UN Charter, there is a provision that says that all UN members, and I'm quoting, should refrain from the use of force versus the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Now, it's conceivable that within the provisions of the UN Charter, at some stage, you could also start a multilateral process which could take the GCSC norm, build on it, and expand it to also include the question of influence operations as well as an attack on the technical infrastructure. I think the importance of influence operation control will be that, and I think Alex defined it very well, the difference between a cyber attack and an influence operation. You can actually affect the outcome of the election. You don't just bring down the technical infrastructure, but you affect the outcome by spreading misinformation or disinformation, by using damaging content, using fake news. So I think I'll stop here for now. I do have some other points on in what context I think norms are useful, but I'd like to respect the time limit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Latha. So we're obviously all sitting in New Delhi for the Raisina Dialogue, and I think that India, like most leading democracies, has to contend with the risk posed by influence operations to its democracy. So, Dr. Rai, I'd love for you to help us understand a little bit more. How does the Indian government perceive and think about these threats, and what is its strategy to confront them?
Thank you. Let me start with a different perspective in the sense that, I mean, many of us have seen how the cyber sector has grown there. It started with the presumption that it should be open, trustful kind of a infrastructure where it will be used for most constructive purposes. That's what the basic thrust or basic premise is on which we started that. Now, as the technology has undergone more innovations, many more technologies have come up, social media has come up, lot many vulnerabilities have also come into the system there. Now, these vulnerabilities have been exploited both for the positive purposes and other for the negative purposes there. Industry has used both negative as well as the positive. The industry has exploited those vulnerabilities more in creating more innovations and more technological things rather than the government. Government has been lagging behind that. The government, world over government, in any part of the world there, or this planet, they have suffered there. And where the Americans says their elections, actually someone utilized, as per the Americans, someone utilized their own technology created by them on them. So there has been a exploitation of the technology innovations because of the vulnerabilities and nature of the technologies. Now, as we move on, the scenario is becoming more and more complex, particularly the technological innovations which we are going on, and I don't have to hesitate in naming artificial intelligence and that kind of a technologies there. These really pose a challenge challenge before us. And the government of India has been seized of. We have a multi-ethnic society. Religion is there, caste system is there, many other factors are there which are not prevalent in the rest of the world there. And we have seen how some of those technologies have played a havoc with the Indian system, riots and all kind of things happen. But the government the first priority is to create awareness, because we cannot stop the innovation of technology. We need to adopt the technology to bring more prosperity and social benefit to our society. That's the first part we need to adopt, and being a democratic society, we cannot put too much regulation or any kind of restrictions on anything there. The first part of the government is to promote and create the awareness among the masses there in different languages, because that is a part of the country. That's the first priority, and we are, not only the government of India is spending its own resources, but I certainly be happy to say that the social media companies have also come forward to work with the government to create that kind of a positive and constructive environment. That's part of the awareness program. Now, if many of you have seen one of the platform called a social media platform, WhatsApp there, in a dialogue with the constructive dialogue with the government of India, they introduced a feature you can't forward the post for more than 5 users there. Yeah. That's a thing. That is a separate issue whether it is useful or not useful there. But at least I see a constructive efforts on the part of the industry to come forward and work with the government of India there. There are issues or many other technical issues there, and the industry is dealing with the government, talking to the government in a very, very constructive environment there. That's the second part of the entire thing. The third part is the norms, which Ms. Latha Reddy has said it. The government is of the view that so far we have been discussing the volunteer norms. There are norms on a volunteer basis there, and the UNGG, 5 for all kind of thing. No more UNGG has been set up there. We are of the strong view that the norms should be not voluntarily there. I mean, because in a multi-stakeholder kind of a approach, the government have certain responsibility, they have been made certain liable, but in this entire approach, the civil society as well as industry also need to take their own share of responsibility there. This is what multi-stakeholder approach is there. So if the norms are volunteer, it will left to the government and the other many sectors, which I said, the stakeholder, they may or they may not participate wholeheartedly there. Today, everything, innovations, although in a way, regulations also are moving toward the private sector things there. So the participation of the industry, academia, and the civil society is a must for this particular kind of a environment or the technology. And we are in dialogue with our stakeholders to prepare themselves or to bring some sort of a consensus among themselves so that we can represent it, we can raise the issue at the international level, when particularly when the next UNGG and the open end group has come up there. That's the third. And the last one, the most predominantly, is that we are focusing on ourselves to develop the technologies there, so as we can detect the kind of a issues which has come up, whether it is a terrorism purposes or you have the misuse of the social information technology or the cyber operations, cyber part is there. So I mean, but that is a challenge which we'll have to go through the aspect because of the onslaught. So, and multiple front, the government is working on that, and I certainly once again acknowledge the help or the association cooperation which we are getting from the industry.
Great, thank you, sir. I think that's a very helpful overview. And one of your comments that you started with about the openness of society and perhaps the vulnerabilities that democracies face, I think is particularly relevant. And wanted to ask Dan, given your background, how do we think about some of the core tensions in liberal democracies in the sense that, you know, democracies pursue national interests, but then they try to maintain their liberal open values, but then populism sometimes arises. And so I guess take a step back and help us think through some of those bigger questions that go to why this particular type of threat is so challenging for democracies.
Let me start with a confession. I'm the only one on the panel who knows nothing about cyber or any of the issues that were discussed so far. I came here to discuss the political and cultural element, and I think it's very interesting. We know what the tension is, and the tension is structural. On the one hand, there are means that you have to use in order to maintain your basic national interests. And on the other hand, you have values, and these values put restraints, should put restraints, and are putting restraints on the means that you can use in order to achieve it. This is a structural tension, it's a healthy tension, and the question is, how do you manage it? And what you have particularly in recent years is a situation where social media radicalized a lot of the attitudes, and what the public hears are more the radicals than the people in the middle of the political spectrum. And on the one hand, on the right, there are those who want to get rid of the restraints and do whatever is necessary for the nation's welfare as they understand it. And on the radical left, there are those who are trying, in the name of human rights, to make the state completely incapable of pursuing its national objectives. And the question is, of course, what is the balance between the two? And here is exactly where information warfare can come in, because this is decided in the public domain. And in the public domain, you can very easily change perceptions by not just information, but also putting the information in a perspective that will lead the voters in one direction or another. And what seems to me by far the most interesting phenomenon in the recent decade is a situation that we see particularly in Europe and to some extent even in the United States, where those people who manage to pursue very radical liberal means have brought about, to a very large extent, populist, right-wing populist, and in very extreme cases, even fascist. There is a dialectic relations between the two, and the key issue, and I believe that this is by far the most important contribution that I can make here in my field, is to look at the question of public trust. Because when you make the government or anybody on your side incapable of dealing with what you consider to be your vital national interests, then the public loses trust in people who did not deliver to them economically or security or vis-a-vis immigration or whatever you can think of. And then they go to the other extreme, and the other extreme says we can deliver. And they can deliver, at least in the short run, but they deliver it at the expense of the basic values. And this way we find ourselves lamenting, how did we lose the mainstream of the public? But actually, we are the ones who are responsible for this in one way or another. I'm not saying that these elements did not exist in the society beforehand, but they were given a chance to take over the government by people who push too far in the other direction. And what I will try to do later, and I hope you will ask me about it, I'm basically inviting a question, okay, what can we do about it? Because the worst possible thing is polarization. When you get in a society two camps that don't listen to each other, that have a zero-sum game, that try to implement policies that will be irreversible, then the result is bad for practically everybody. And there is a way of dealing with it. It's very complex, and therefore I will leave it to the second part of the discussion.
Sounds good. We'll definitely explore that momentarily. I see Alex leaning forward, and I know we've covered a lot on the panel, and I think, you know, in the hopes of sort of engendering a more free-flowing conversation, did anybody say anything that you wanted to respond to, disagree with, push back, just sort of see where it goes, or expand upon your opening comments? Or do you want me to frame up a different question today?
Both, we can do that. I was going to pick up on some of the comments regarding, for instance, the role of the UN Charter and information operations, and then maybe pick up to the last comment about the larger historical forces. So I think it's important to understand that at present, for instance, the UN Charter is very clear on what it defines as armed attack and use of force. And those are, so what one country does to another, that could effectively constitute a casus belli or an act of war. And at the present, that does not include being mean to each other. You have to blow stuff up, you have to kill people, and it has to be done considerable amount before actually, under the UN context, it can be considered an act inviting a kinetic response. And that's either a use of force or armed assault. If you're European, you think there's a difference between the two. If you're American, you think it's all the same thing. But use of force is the term that we use. Information warfare does not fall in that category at the moment. And countries like Russia and China would maybe like that, because that would also invite us to look more closely at managing content. From their point of view, one of the biggest concerns is, of course, hostile criticism of their regime. And for that reason, they are mostly concerned with the ability to manage cyberspace within their own domain. This is what cyber sovereignty means, and this is why sovereignty is such an important concept in cyberspace. It means we decide what people can view in cyberspace in our country. So that is part of the information warfare debate, which is effectively boils down to, is information a weapon or not? And those who are in the liberal democratic worldview argue against it. We say information is not a weapon. A weapon is a weapon. Information is not a weapon. There are those, however, who want to change that debate, and I think it's very important that we keep in mind that currently as international law is constituted, that doesn't work. You really do have to destroy things for it to constitute an act of war, and that's hopefully where things will remain in the future. To come back to the last comment about how did we arrive in this current state that of populism and the use of information warfare means, and how does it fall on fertile ground? I think there's two different views we can take. A very broad historic view and a very systemic view concentrating, for instance, on social media. The broad historic view is that basically we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Every industrial revolution, going back to the beginning of this, 19th century, was accompanied by a significant social change. Each of that social change also had a large built-up expectations within certain populations regarding their future, their status, and their economic well-being. This is very well mapped out in economic history. I'm originally trained as an economic historian, and I can tell you that there's a lot of research that has been done on so-called expectation theory. So one way to explain some of the problems that we're having currently right now, to build up what was said previously, is that we are actually seeing a state where the expectations of a large portion of the population are just not being met because they're able to perceive things differently due to the advent of new technology. In other words, the ability to be connected everywhere makes you envious. And envy drives a lot of hostile reaction. Part of that is what is now being called the attention economy. The attention economy, which is of course the substance for Facebook, Google, and a lot of many other internet-based entities, means that we don't pay, of course, with our credit card, we pay with our awareness. And guess what? The people who have the largest attention to a spend are not necessarily those who have full-time employment. So those are suddenly super empowered individuals. A lot of people who have maybe see themselves as being underutilized or unemployed or otherwise basically not socially integrated have a lot more attention to spend on those resources. So that brings me back to the final point, is that we're looking at these two factors, a wider historical factor of perhaps economic historical change, but also something very systemic that's happening within this technological event. We have to ask ourselves, how do we survive this transition to this new plateau that we're going to go to? And my recommendation is just simply to be careful, that by trying to adjust the implications of, first of all, this economic change, but also this new technology, we don't overshoot. And overshooting could be, as Carl Bildt said today, thinking that to get better security in the internet, we decide we have to nationalize the internet. That, for instance, would for me be a dangerous route to go. The internet has worked quite well so far. The multi-stakeholder model has produced a rather well-functioning global resource. If we actually, in the name of security and trying to get rid of information operations or fake news or similar, go further than that and try to manage this resource too intensely, we might kill it, and with it, our democracy.
Great, Alex. No, I think highlighting that tension and that balancing act is quite apt. And I wonder if, Katie, if there's anything you'd like to add about how, Facebook thinks about that historical perspective and some of the technologies that have come previously, and whether there have been lessons that have been learned that you think inform your thinking, or if the internet is just so new and dynamic, and this fourth industrial revolution, if you want to call it that, is somewhat unique with the advent of AI and other technologies that are just materially changing everything, such that previous history is not as much of a guide star as it normally would be.
No, I think it's a. Oops, sorry. I think it's a great. It's a great question, and I and we as Facebook have been thinking about this, I think, in a couple of different ways. Fake news has been around for a very long period of time. You go back, to the printing press, or even before that, people were spreading rumors about others. They were sharing wrong information. That has happened in the political context for a very long period of time. What is now happening is just with the internet and with social media, the speed at which that spreads is so much quicker, and the ability in which to correct that information is much harder in which to do. And so I think one of the areas where we struggle with is trying to determine how activity people do offline versus online be governed differently. And thinking about that and that behavior. What is it, when we think about fake news, false news, however you want to say it, we have taken the stance that we don't take that down. So you have the right, Alex has the right to say that the sun rises in the west if he wants to, but he doesn't have the right for us to amplify that. I think the other thing too to really keep in mind, as well as when we're thinking about this, is some of the activity we saw in 2016 and with the IRA. That wasn't necessarily false news. It was much more around polarizing and dividing people around some of these issues and driving wedge issues. There was definitely false news issues, but those were a lot of Macedonian teenagers who were wanting to make money. And then there was also domestic aspects of that too that I think we haven't even really started to explore in 2016 that we started to explore in 2018. So I think we have to be really careful too about not to conflate different issues that we are seeing as part of this. But a lot of what I'm saying with all of that is that I think it also goes to what do you look at of taking actions against the behavior that people are doing? Fake accounts, spamming, pretending to be somebody that you're not, versus what you are actually saying. For instance, and then I'll be quiet, for the midterms, one of the things I was really concerned about is I didn't want people to be like, okay, yeah, maybe they figured out how to help stop foreign interference, and they did a pretty good job of that, but there's still all of this fake news happening domestically. And we actually took action on a bunch of pages that were engaging in both coordinated inauthentic behavior and civic spam, trying to share a lot of false news. And most false news is, there's some truths and then there's some falsehoods in that too. And they were trying to spread that spread that information. That was all about the behavior that they were doing and trying to spread that information. It wasn't about what they were saying, which is another thing we're trying to combat now too, is in taking some of these actions being accused of political bias in one way or the other. So there are a lot of different aspects to it, and I guess what we're trying to say is we're trying to look at different pieces of history, and a lot of these things have existed before, but the speed and the behaviors of how people do it are evolving.
Right. No, I think that's fair, and I wonder, Dr. Rai and Latha, sort of for India having had since its founding to manage a multi-ethnic, highly diverse society, and to some extent place limitations on speech in the hopes of preserving liberal democracy, how the history of India and lessons it's learned are informing the current strategy and what you're helping to teach other democracies about how to confront this threat.
No, first of all, I must say that India has not put any restriction on the freedom of speech or free speech there. Not at all. Our constitution says, there is Article 19.2, and article says that there is be a reasonable restrictions, whether you talk about the voice or you talk about the print or you talk about any media. And that article has been applied to the cyber aspects also. Certainly we don't have any kind of a restriction. I would amply like to make it very, very clear. But then, see, there is a famous Stott case in the UK there, where someone was hurling the umbrella, and it hurt the nose of someone else there nearby there. They went to the court. The court said that you have the freedom to move or hurl all your umbrella as long as it doesn't hurt the other one. I think that's the reasonable restrictions one has to understand and do that kind of things there. That's one aspect there. But if you look at the question which you asked me, really, how does India, I answered in the first, that is a more awareness creating there.
Right.
But we have a different cultural kind of things also. Our society is also known to be culturally very, very tolerant kind of things also there. And I think that kind of that is built in our genetics. But due to, some spirit comes up there. But I think basically we are a basic tolerant society. And with the kind of steps which I said, it is again with the cooperation of the industry, we would be able to do that. But I must come back to what Alexa is. I would like to say that. See, today the way the complexity in the technology is coming up there, finding solutions also is becoming more and more difficult there. Countries also taking a point, and they are changing the policies. At one time, there was a cyber defense was a rather policy. If you look at it, the whole distinction between information warfare and the cyber operation, which Alexa tried today, it has come up as technology has come up, part of it. And now people talk about the cyber deterrence, we talk about the active defense, that kind of technology, or that's a overall kind of a thing. No one talks about the security or the kind of a thing, that's all. So those concepts are moving internationally also. And I think I will certainly like to say, or disagree with my senior colleague or with Alexa, the UN Charter as of today will need different kind of amendment if we have to address the cyber kind of a thing. The whole deterrent philosophy deals with the killing of the people there, with the self-defense kind of Alexa stooped the words there. There is a killing of the people is one of the premises in that part. But the cyber, there is no killing of the people. There may not be killing of the physical property also. So that those aspects need to be seen, and those aspects are becoming more and more difficult. We need to find a challenge, and we need to deal with this the challenge. Today, it appears to be much more, as I see, is a more difficult task. But let us see how do we do about it.
Would you like to add anything, Latha?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add a little to what my friend Gulshan has said, that, yes, India is is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual society. And that brings with it its own challenges as well as we take great pride in it. You know, we talk about unity in diversity and so on and so forth. But the question is, these diversities can also very easily be inflamed. And people can be set against each other in groups. And I think that's the real toss-up, which Dan also referred to, you know, that, you know, when the public is not happy, when it loses its trust in the government or in the system of law and order and so on, you can actually have quite a serious breakdown of communications. And I think that we've been lucky in India in that we've had some terrible incidents, but they've been very sporadic and very localized. You know, we have never really had all India, I would say since the time of partition perhaps. It's not spread over large parts of India. So there I would agree with you, Gulshan. I think essentially there's a certain tolerance, a certain flexibility in the Indian system. But the problem is that, and here I'd like to say, Katie, that because of social media, you know, this has actually really become a bit of a problem now, you know, as you know. I mean, you've talked a lot about it, I'm sure, with my colleagues who are in the government, because it can spread like wildfire, you know. I don't know how many of you would have heard the session today where a young police officer from Telangana spoke about her terrible experiences in an area called Mehboob Nagar, where there was complete fake news and morphed videos being circulated of child kidnappers. And as a result, any stranger in that area was branded as a child kidnapper and was being lynched. And there were one or two very unfortunate incidents. And, you know, then she had to control the law and order situation. And in the old days, rumors may have circulated. There may have been a stray incident. But it was easy for people who were doing the law and order to win back the confidence of people. Today, people would rather believe a WhatsApp message or what's circulating on Twitter. And when an authority puts out a counter and says this is not true, they say, oh, you're just saying it because you know, you want to cover up the truth. So this is a real dilemma. And I think we have to recognize that in different societies, there are different dilemmas. You know, in the West, you wouldn't have a situation where people go out and lynch somebody because there was something on WhatsApp. At least I hope you don't. But here, it's a very real possibility.
Right. No, I think.
No, but you see, we have one blessing in disguise that, see, India has more than 200 news channels. So any news, our media is also very active there. If, I mean, it spreads in the media almost at the same time it goes in the social media there. So at times that puts as a check and balance. The people do look at the TV screens and find out.
Right.
And we have a national channel, we have a district channel, we have a state channel. Those kind of things.
Right. No, there are a lot of players that make it complicated. So I think Dan wanted to come in with a quick comment, and then I want to make sure we open it up for questions and answers. So I just say, Dan's going to comment for a minute or two, and then think of questions, and then I will call on people. We'll take about 4 or 5 questions from the audience. So Dan.
The question is how to combine the two. In other words, how to pursue national interest without losing our basic values. And I would say the following. Restraints are something that are unnatural. The most natural thing is if you disagree with somebody is to kill him. And I'm delighted that we live in a society that managed to educate people that this may be very satisfactory for the first 5 minutes, but later you will pay for it in a way that is catastrophic. And therefore the question is, how can you persuade people to restrain themselves? And the first necessary condition is self-confidence. A person who's afraid, who thinks that something terrible is going to happen to him, will not accept restraints. So don't take away from people their self-confidence. Don't remove their solidarity groups that they can rely on. And therefore, for instance, don't undermine nationalism. Don't assume that any nationalism must develop into chauvinism and later into fascism. Don't assume that nationalism in itself is something bad. Go to a benign nationalism. This is the best immune system for a malignant nationalism. And actually, this is an advice to elites, because elites have this problem that they seek the best. The best is the worst enemy of the good. When you're trying to be perfect, the only way you can be perfect is to be a perfect idiot. There is no way to reach it, and therefore, try to go for digestibility. What can you do in a positive way and take your people with you towards it, because otherwise they will go to the other extreme. And if you say anybody who's defending our borders is a fascist, they will go to the fascists. And that's the problem. You need to give them a good combination of the two. And again, the key word is digestibility.
There you go. So with that, let's open it up to Q&A. And so I've been asked to ask the ORF, the Raisina fellows in the room, if any of them want to get the conversation started. So the gentleman here up front. And please just identify yourself before you ask your question.
Yeah, hi. This is Jiten. I'm from India. So my question is to the panel, whoever would choose to answer, maybe from the government or Facebook. You know, in last 6 months, we have had 3 data analytics stuff coming out from 3 think tanks and analytical agencies analyzing the tweets and the data given by Facebook and Twitter. And 2 of them said that there was certain influence operation originating from Russia during US midterm elections. There was another one recently, 2 months back, which said that there was another set of influence operations originating from Iran. But we have not seen any study concerning any other democracy, regarding any other democracy in the world. Like, there's nothing towards Indian elections. And it's not that India has not faced influence operations in the past. We have had riots, as Dr. Rai said. We have had, influence operations in Telangana. And there's been a lot of stuff happening on Indian, democratic space also. But we are literally not seeing any of those constructive analytical studies of the data from, Twitter or Facebook. Is it because that, till the last 10 years, West had this definition of good terrorism and bad terrorism when it came to South Asia. Western priorities were more important in definitions than the, South Asian ones. Are you dealing again, with the data with the same way that U.S. elections, U.S. Influence in U.S. is more important, and you will only react when it affects U.S. and you will not take anything proactive other than, when you are forced to do something when it comes to South Asian democracies?
No, I think that's a very fair question, and I think the U.S. obviously does get a lot of attention, but we've actually done a lot of work and takedowns in the Mexican election, the Brazilian elections. Recently here, ahead of the Bangladesh elections, we did take down, it was small. It was 9 pages and 6 accounts that were doing coordinated inauthentic behavior, but it was connected to the government. That we found. And so we are working across a wide variety of different elections, and the Indian elections are ones that we are putting a lot of resources in order to be looking at the different threats that we might be facing in the election, again, both foreign and domestic, of what might be happening. And so I wouldn't say that, and this is something too we are continuing to build up our resources and our capabilities of, and the expertise, because somebody who might be experts of what might be happening in the US or Russian disinformation is not going to necessarily have the same expertise that's needed here in India. So what I want to say is absolutely we're not just focused on the US. We are taking a global approach to this and also wanting to make sure we are approaching every country for the unique risks that it might be facing. As we are monitoring the Indian elections, we'll be releasing information of things that we find, just like we have for others. So I can't say that anything is going to be coming out, but you have our commitment to be as transparent as possible as part of that.
Great. Thanks, Katie.
If I'm allowed to continue to raise the issue of Jiten, apart from the panelists there. See, the revenue model of all the social media is a unique model there. Higher the TRP rating, higher the controversy on the media, higher the revenues from the social media, because they earn from the kind of a advertisement there. And my request, if I am asking from the Jiten point of view, I think you will have to earmark certain percentage of your revenue which you earn because of that controversy towards the bringing promotional awareness in that particular country.
Okay, fair point. Ma'am.
My question is related to influence operations and information warfare, and the fact that many liberal democracies are facing the dilemma of other outside influences utilizing or manipulating the freedom and openness of these societies against them, or attacking the democratic system by distributing fake news or other content that could undermine credibility of government and also credibility in the democratic system itself. And in light of this phenomenon, oh, by the way, I'm from the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. In light of this phenomenon, I think the question or policy challenge for all of us is what to do about it. And of course, some societies are trying to develop a social immunity to fake news by some verification applications or fact-checking sites. But that that the rate of that does not meet with the pervasive production of fake news or misleading or information that is aimed or targeting at influencing elections or political stability. And so the question is, as we see some countries like Germany, they have already produced legislation that would require social media platform providers to a certain degree to be self-restrictive or to exercise content management. Now, the question for Facebook, the Facebook representative here, is this German model a workable model for other democracies? Because in my own experience in going forward with policy discussions on regulation, especially when we are also facing the dilemma of protecting and defending free speech as a core value, but at the same time, regulating content.
Right.
How does that work for other countries?
Okay, I think that's a great question. Let me just stop you there so that we can get a response to that and try to fit in a couple more questions. So I don't know if Katie, you want to start, and then Alex, you want to chime in too.
Yeah, just I think really quickly, I think we are open to, and are working with governments and what the right regulation might be in this space in a lot of different areas. I think one of the struggles we've had with the law in Germany is that it has caused social media companies like ours, we are going to err on the side of taking something down versus leaving it up. So on the first day of NetZG, I can't talk, NetDG, sorry, at 11 o'clock at night, was that on the first day we were, the content was taken down, I believe, from the AFD, which immediately spur questions about censorship and freedom of speech. One really quick, because I know we want to get to other questions. I think the important thing, too, when looking at how we fight this type of activity is it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And I'm not just talking about government, civil society, and other organizations working together. I'm also talking about when we look at a lot of this activity, first, for us, we got to look at how can we take down fake accounts? How can we do better? Because most entities that are trying to do something bad on our platform, they're not using their real identities. They're creating fake accounts. So how can we get better at finding that? How can we look at scalable ways when it comes to false news? Some of it's economic incentives. They're trying to make money. So how can we make it so that their content's being shown to less people, so less people are clicking on it? And how can we be looking at things like that? It's also not just as easy as telling somebody something's fake. We initially, when we did our false news stuff, we put a big red disputed flag. Turns out that caused people to believe it even more. So there's a lot of work. And then there's a lot of work we're trying to do on the transparency side as well, around political ad transparency, which we're bringing up. So happy to answer additional questions on it, because we could dig into all of that a lot more. But I think it's going to take looking at this and hitting this problem from a lot of different angles in order to try to find solutions.
So a funny side story on NetDG and that's implementation. So one of the politicians who was the author of that particular piece of legislation accused on Twitter his political opponent of being an idiot, and Twitter promptly censored him for abuse of speech. So that just goes to show you that NetDG still has a couple of kinks to work out, and that's only one element that people can use to try to address the information operations / fake news conundrum. But the narrative that we most commonly use in Europe to address it is basically just resiliency. And resiliency is built upon many different levers, and most of those are not going to be found only in regulating the social media activities of a couple of companies, although that definitely plays a certain role. if you look at it, there's been covert influencing attempts at a national scale in France, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the United States. The United States happened to be probably rather successful, but in many other countries it wasn't that successful. If you look at what happened in Sweden, for instance, they had the most prolonged exposure to an information warfare campaign. At the end of that 3 or 4 year period, which saw many different prongs of that campaign occurring, effectively potential public opinion favorable towards a NATO membership went from, I think, 26% to 48%. And they reintroduced conscription. So, I mean, it kind of backfired, whatever the intent was of that campaign. It backfired in a big way. And the reason was that Sweden had a built-in national resiliency model that other countries are now trying to copy. And this is where the problem is going to be. You can't really copy a model like that. Everyone has to have their own model. So to come back on what was said beforehand, it will involve also working together with the private sector, and also is going to it's also going to involve, however, education. It's also going to look at new ways of doing public diplomacy and working with the media enterprises. But most importantly, it's going to involve us being careful. For those of us who have an interest in liberal democratic values, the biggest danger here is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I really believe this is a danger that can happen if we overshoot on this. There are considerable dangers that we are faced with information warfare operations, but fundamentally, democracies are resilient. We are in the biggest democracy in the world right now. India has gone through a huge amount of political violence, and it's still here. That's a perfect example of why we should take actually some faith in our institutions and not worry too much about this getting out of control.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And Dan, I think you wanted to ask me, then we'll go to the last question over there.
Very short one. One important measure is to expose countries who do it as a national strategy, and particularly Russia. And I think it is worthwhile exposing that intelligence organizations, whenever they have information about it, will make it public, and leaders will constantly barrage Russia so that everybody knows whatever comes out of Russia is trying to destroy democratic societies. And I think that the more people are aware of it, the less effective the Russian intervention will be.
Sure, please, Latha.
I just want to say, that I get the point, and we are a democracy, and yes, we also get very offended when our democracy is attacked in any way. But may I say that I don't think just being a democracy means that, you get to object, and nobody else gets to object if they get attacked, who are not a democracy. I think in India, we've always accepted that countries have a right to choose their own form of government. And we don't necessarily say that democracy is the only way to be. It's our way to be. And we hope you will also come to it, but in your own time, in your own space. But my point is it's wrong for anybody to attack a process or to spread disinformation in any other country. It's not only that when democracies get attacked, we should object. We should object to attacks, whomever it's coming from and wherever it's directed.
Great. Thank you for that additional point. Last question.
I'm Krzysztof Zalewski from Poland. I have rather, also experience with elections and involvement, not necessarily foreign involvement, but considerable involvement in 2015, a year before American elections. And my question would be, shouldn't we do something with the anonymity of the users in internet? Because if I open a bank account, I need to present my ID. If I open a Facebook account, I do not need to present anything. So shouldn't we just move from content policing to basically identification of the people who speak, as it used to be in, before. Everybody had the right to speak freely, but there was no condition of autonomy to being, anonym, like 20, 30 years ago. And just also the place where you speak from. So I can imagine very simply that if I post something on Facebook, I am tagged what place I am posting from. So wouldn't be it wise to move from the content policing to the basically control of the users and making sure that everybody is speaking in its own name? Thank you.
Great. So, I mean, I think historically the use of pseudonyms and other ways of anonymously communicating, you know, so, right, so right, I mean, so. Well, you can throw them out there. We may not get to them just because we're basically out of time. So gentleman there and then gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Bhuvan. I'm a journalist with AFP. So I would want to qualify the point about having people not allowing them to post anonymously on social media platforms. I would say we should kind of treat it in and think about it a little more, because if you look at democracies like India or places like, developing places, having the power to post anonymously has kind of leveled the playing field for many people who post very critical and important information online and publicly. That is one part. And to Facebook, I would want to ask is that I know you've been trying to get fake news or fake information off the site, of the platform, and also collaborated with news organizations and certain news organizations as well. But have you been clear enough about, you've told us what you want to do, but have you been clear enough about how exactly you're doing it? Because the fact is that even if you actually remove certain fake information or fake, especially in political and religious context, in democracies, in places like India, you could still actually be part of the problem, because you are only targeting a certain section or a certain ideological bent and not necessarily the other, because that also kind of opens you up for more bias allegations, and that applies to governments as well. So how exactly do you think that can be addressed?
Okay, thank you for that. And gentlemen, last question, then we're going to close the questions. Yep.
Just a first clarification to Katie. Facebook about 5 years ago did a very good thing recently by cleaning up ways that people can actually grab information from the privacy of people. So when Zuckerberg was facing Congress, he said they've done changes, which is really good. Currently, right now, you can use Google to log into people's home cameras and watch them eat, have dinner. You can find out people who are tweeting around a kilometer radius of this GPS location on Twitter. Is there any work that Facebook is doing with other social media agencies that they're collaborating to make some of those practices widespread? Because that was a really good thing that Facebook did, and all the others are not doing the same. And using open source applications right now, people are being able to grab very sensitive information. For example, even a Twitter account that is locked, I should be able to see somebody's details, which is not supposed to be done. I don't know if there's any work that is going on.
Great. Thank you for that. So what I'm going to basically say is ask each panelist to give very quick concluding remarks. Feel free to address questions from the audience, and then we're going to wrap. So why don't we start with Dan, and we'll just go down the line. Anything? No, Latha, anything you'd like to say to respond or conclude?
I'd just like to say one thing, that I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because we're going to be dealing with even more challenging new technologies, and if we haven't been able to keep up with how we're going to regulate it in a way that doesn't stifle innovation and encourages new technologies to develop, and as the technologies get more and more, you all know about the Internet of Things, you all know about the issues of artificial intelligence. We're going to be dealing, each of us, with hundreds of connected devices. And so my plea would be that we must really start to look at this question of how do we make this safer? How do we make cyberspace safer so that we continue to regard it as a blessing, as something that we adore using, rather than as something that we become fearful of using.
Great. Thank you, Latha. Dr. Rai?
I think the concept of the multi-stakeholder has to be implemented in the true sense there. The regulations will be quite, they will have to, they will be late in addressing the technological innovations there. So I think the industry and the civil society in this multi-stakeholder has a more predominant role to help the government and work with the government to preserve the democracy and the ill effect of the technological innovations, so that we can bring more benefits to our social development, to the population of this technological innovation.
Great. Thank you, sir.
So I think, and I want to try to very quickly address some of the questions that were here, but the theme that I see in all of it is that this is very much at the very beginning, and we all need to keep talking about this because there are still a lot of very open questions. Anonymity on the internet, I think, is a great one. It is one that we are, looking at when it comes to political ads. We require people to authorize and give us their ID and have to prove they live in that country. For pages with large followings, requiring the same from admins. But there's been a lot of discussion we've been having internally over what dangers might you be putting people into if they are dissenting in certain countries, where that could then end up where they could be jailed or hurt or killed, or in many of those situations. And so it is I think it is a great thing to have the conversation about, but it's still very much an open question on those rights. Very much working with other companies and trying to think about different standards in this, and what does this look like. Different platforms of different things online, different companies online are going to look differently. I mean, we haven't even started talking about virtual reality or deep fakes or anything like that. And so I think, we are working with a lot of the different companies that are thinking about this, but this is going to require a lot of different folks coming to the table and having these conversations. And so and then, sir, to your question about have we done enough about talking about what we do around false news, we clearly haven't, because first, we don't take it down. We're just reducing it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we come to Raisina Dialogues, why we go to a lot of these different conferences, why we're here and trying to speak more about this, because this is very complicated, and it also is constantly evolving. And so I think we just need to make sure we keep having these conversations as these things are being developed, and be okay with the fact that we're going to have differing viewpoints, and we're going to need to have a robust conversation to get to a place where we know what the right solutions might be.
So as the last speaker, I get to agree with what everyone else said. But I would add to that. I would just basically say that cyberspace is effectively the first artificial domain that humans have ever created. We have the land domain, we have the air domain, we have the sea domain, we have a space domain for those of us that can access it. But cyberspace is the first domain where we literally say, what are the natural laws? What is gravity? So whatever we say are the physical laws in cyberspace become the physical laws. If we want to turn gravity on or off, we can do that. That's why our opinion of cyberspace is so important. And this is where it gets me back to what the comments were beforehand. For instance, the importance of the multi-stakeholder model in managing this ecosystem, and how it, as our co-chair said beforehand, all of this is about to get a lot worse before it even has any hope of getting better. And the reason is that we are really going to have to find a new way of working together to manage this type of very complex ecosystem. And the multi-stakeholder model basically means that, for instance, corporations are going to continue to play a very important role in getting their products right, making sure their services aren't abused for instance, political purposes, for disinformation campaigns and similar. And for instance, Facebook had started a couple of years back an idea of outing, for instance, misuse of their services online, be it Russia, be it other governments, be it a private enterprise, doesn't matter. And that would have, for instance, be one of those useful steps for those companies to continue looking at. Governments need to, for instance, have real measures in place to respond to these types of interference operations. One of the biggest tragedies is that Western democracies seemed to be unable to really find a coherent narrative to respond to what they consider to be bad propaganda, while, for instance, countries, Russia and China, stand there and say, well, you influence our political sovereignty as well. You support pro-democracy groups. We consider that an intervention in our domestic affairs. What do you say to that? And somehow, people have not provided a coherent answer to that. And finally, us as users in the civil society. Again, we make cyberspace. Everyone here in this room, with their opinions about what the dangers of fake news are, or the protection of critical infrastructure, or literally how much you care about data protection, helps define the political narrative in your own country. And you should be very, very aware of the fact that if we get this wrong, this domain, where all our data resides, where our opinions are formed, where our children's lives are going to be basically grown, are effectively determined by our opinions right now. If we decide that this has to be in a domain where there's no anonymity, where everyone is tracked and followed from the very beginning, we're basically run around with barcodes on our heads, that's going to be a world where liberal democracy has a very hard time in existing. And that is really a decision that maybe every country should make for itself, but liberal democracies are the ones that gave birth to the internet. And I really think if we don't protect it, we will also kill it in the same way as well. So please keep in mind that we have a lot of responsibility to go around here. Nobody can duck it. And information warfare might be one of the biggest threats to the internet overall.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panelists.